2 British prisoners in a German castle were building a glider to escape. Hidden in the attic of the chapel, wings from bed slats, cables from castle wiring, sealed with boiled millet. They planned to launch it from the roof, using a bathtub full of concrete as a catapult. It was the final winter of the Second World War. They never got the chance. Almost 70 years later, somebody else built the same glider. It flew. This is a video about 7 famous prisons in Europe and what you were never told. We are starting with that castle. Number 7. Colditz Castle stands on a rock above the River Mulde in the German state of Saxony. In 1939, the German army decided it would make a very good prison for a specific kind of inmate, officers who had already escaped from other camps. Put all the problem prisoners in one place, on a cliff with 2-meter walls, 640 kilometers from the nearest neutral border. Field Marshal Hermann Göring declared Colditz to be escape-proof. What Göring did not consider was what happens when you put several hundred of the most determined escape artists in Europe into a single building with nothing to do. Within a year, there were so many parallel tunnels being dug that the inmates had to form an international escape committee to keep the Belgians, the Dutch, and the Poles from digging into each other. A British flight lieutenant named Dominic Bruce climbed into a Red Cross shipping crate, had himself delivered to a storage room, broke out of the crate, and climbed down the outside of the castle on a rope of bed sheets. He left a note behind, in German. "The air in Colditz no longer pleases me. See you later." And then there was the aeroplane. In the final winter of the war, 2 British pilots began building a glider in an attic above the prison chapel behind a false wall they had built themselves. Wing ribs from bed slats, spars from floorboards, control cables from castle wiring. The skin was blue and white checked cotton from prison sleeping bags, sealed with boiled millet as glue. The plan was to launch the glider from the chapel roof, across the River Mulde, using a runway made of tables and a catapult powered by a bathtub full of concrete attached to a pulley. The bathtub would drop, the glider would accelerate, it would fly or it would not. It would fly or it would not. It was never tested. The American army arrived 2 weeks before the scheduled launch. Colditz ended up in the Soviet zone and the glider disappeared. For decades, people assumed the story had been exaggerated. In 2012, a full-sized radio-controlled replica was built from the original drawings and launched from the same roof. It flew cleanly across the river and landed in a meadow 180 meters below. The escape plan would have worked. In 5.5 years of constant escape attempts, not a single prisoner was shot trying to get out. Göring's escape-proof prison produced more successful escapes than any other German camp. You can visit Colditz today. The glider replica hangs in the chapel attic. You can stand on the roof and imagine the bathtub dropping. Number 6. Reading is a quiet market town about an hour west of London. For 2 years at the end of the 19th century, its old red brick prison held the most famous writer in the English-speaking world. On the 25th of May, 1895, Oscar Wilde was convicted of gross indecency, the Victorian legal term for homosexuality, illegal in Britain until 1967. Wilde was the author of The Importance of Being Earnest, the most celebrated playwright of his generation, one of the most famous men in London. By the time he arrived at the prison gates, he had lost everything: his marriage, his children, his house, his money, his reputation. He was sentenced to 2 years of hard labor. Hard labor meant 6 hours a day on a treadwheel, a large wooden wheel with steps around its circumference. The prisoner climbed the steps. The wheel turned. It did not power anything. The point was exhaustion. Prisoners were not allowed to speak to one another. They wore masks over their faces when they were moved between cells. Wilde was not permitted to be called Oscar Wilde. He was permitted to be called C.3.3. C for cell block C, 3 for the third landing, 3 for the third cell. That was his name for 2 years. While Wilde was there, a soldier named Charles Thomas Wooldridge was hanged inside the prison. He had murdered his wife in a jealous rage. Wilde never met him, only saw him at a distance in the prison yard. The night before the execution, no prisoner in Reading slept. After his release, Wilde exiled himself to France. In Normandy, he wrote a long poem about what he had seen. He called it The Ballad of Reading Gaol, and dedicated it to CTW, a former trooper of the Royal Horse Guards. The most famous line in the poem is 7 words long. Each man kills the thing he loves. It is a line about a soldier who murdered his wife. It is also a line about a writer who loved another man and lost everything for it. He published the poem in 1898, not under his own name, because his name was worthless, but under his prison number, C.3.3. It was his last great work. He died 2 years later in a cheap hotel in Paris, at 46. He had been too poor to pay for his own funeral. In 2021, an anonymous artist named Banksy painted a mural on the outside wall of the empty prison. It showed a prisoner escaping on a rope of tied bed sheets, with a typewriter tied to the bottom. It was a clear argument. Keep the building, make it about Wilde. As of today, the prison is still empty. The mural is still there. Nobody is sure what will happen to the building where C.3.3 climbed a wheel that did not power anything 6 hours a day for 2 years. If you are still here, consider subscribing. The next entry is the strangest one on this list. Number 5. About 40 kilometers southeast of Athens, off the tip of Cape Sunion, there is an island shaped like a long gray fish. Tourists at the Temple of Poseidon can see it, 4 kilometers offshore. They almost never ask what it is. What it is a 13-kilometer-long rock with almost no fresh water and almost no shade. Between 1947 and 1955, somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 Greek citizens were held there, against their will, by their own government. After the Second World War, Greece fell into a civil war. The resistance that had fought the Nazis had been dominated by communists, and when the Germans left, they tried to take the country. They failed. The right-wing government won with British and American backing, and then needed a place for the people it could not trust, not soldiers, teachers, poets, students, anyone whose brothers had been in the resistance. They sent them to Makronisos. The official euphemism was re-education. In practice, you arrived by boat. You were told to sing a song in praise of the Greek king, and if you refused, you were beaten. Then you were given tools and told to build your own prison camp, and then you were told to build replicas of the Parthenon. This is the part that nobody believes when you first say it. The Greek government's ideology in 1947 was that ancient Greece, the Greece of Pericles and Plato, was fundamentally incompatible with communism. To be redeemed, a Makronisos prisoner had to prove he had chosen civilization over the disease. The way he proved it was by building scale replicas of classical Greek monuments with his own hands, small versions of the Parthenon, a theater of Dionysus, an amphitheater. Photographs were sent to the international press to show the world how Greece was healing its sick. Among the prisoners was a young composer named Mikis Theodorakis, who later wrote the score for the film Zorba the Greek. He was in Makronisos twice. The first time he was beaten so badly that his legs were broken. The island held an entire generation of Greek artists and intellectuals, and tried very hard to break them. Many were broken. But the island did not erase them. The last prisoners left in 1961. The ruins of the camps and the remains of the scale model Parthenon are still out there, crumbling on a rock nobody visits. If you stand at Cape Sunion today and look southeast, you can see the low gray shape on the horizon. Most tourists think it is just another Greek island. Most Greeks know what it is and do not say anything. Number 4. On the Ile de la Cité in the middle of Paris, 5 minutes from Notre Dame, there is a building most tourists walk past without noticing. For 76 days, in the autumn of 1793, a former Queen of France slept on a straw mattress inside it and waited to die. The building is called the Conciergerie. By 1793, 4 years into the Revolution, Parisians had a nickname for it: the antechamber to the guillotine, which around 4,000 prisoners passed through on their way to the Revolutionary Tribunal upstairs. 19 out of every 20 were condemned to death. Marie Antoinette arrived on the 1st of August, 1793. She was 37. Her husband, King Louis XVI, had been guillotined 7 months earlier. Her hair had turned white during the previous winter. She looked 60. She was given a small cell on the ground floor. A guard sat in the corner behind a folding screen, 24 hours a day. He never left. Marie Antoinette had no privacy to wash, to change, or to use the chamber pot for 76 days. Her trial began on the 14th of October. It lasted 20 hours. She was accused of treason and in a charge so crude that the prosecutor himself barely defended it. Of incest with her 8-year-old son, she refused to answer directly. Instead, she turned to the women in the audience and said, "I appeal to all mothers." The women, many of whom had come to jeer at her, stopped jeering. It did not save her. The verdict was announced at 4 a.m. She was guillotined at 12 minutes past 12 the same day. 9 months later, the Reign of Terror ended. Maximilien Robespierre, the man who had been running it, was guillotined. And the chief prosecutor of the Revolutionary Tribunal, the man who had stood in that same courtroom and asked for the death of thousands, was arrested, tried in the same room, sentenced in the same room, and driven by the same route to the same guillotine. The Conciergerie is a museum today. Most visitors spend about 40 minutes. Notre Dame is 5 minutes away, and they are usually in a hurry to get there. Number 3. On a square northeast of the Kremlin, there's a large yellow building that most Russians will not point out to you if you ask. It is called the Lubyanka. During the 20th century, it was the most feared building in the Soviet Union. It was built in 1898 as the headquarters of an insurance company. After the Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks gave it to the newly created secret police. The names of that secret police changed over the decades: Cheka, NKVD, KGB, FSB. But the address did not. Under Stalin, the prison attached to the building processed more of the victims of the Great Purge than any other location in the country. Writers, generals, old Bolsheviks who had made the revolution and now found themselves accused of being enemies of it. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the Russian writer who later won the Nobel Prize for the Gulag Archipelago, was held here in 1945. After a letter he had written to a friend criticizing Stalin was intercepted by military censors. There is a Soviet-era joke about the Lubyanka. What is the tallest building in Moscow? The Lubyanka. Because from its basement, you can see all the way to Siberia. Siberia, in the joke, means the Gulag. If the Lubyanka caught you, the rest of your life would be spent in a labor camp east of the Urals. And that was mostly true. The Lubyanka did not kill most of its prisoners. It processed them. It interrogated them for weeks while depriving them of sleep, then put them on trains going east. Prisoners were led through the building with their eyes covered, down corridors that turned back on themselves, much until they had no idea whether they were in the basement or on the top floor. In fact, the cells were on the top floor, windowless, so that prisoners assumed they were underground. But the joke was also half wrong. The basement was not only a metaphor, the basement was the real killing floor. The executions happened there, in a padded room, the walls thick enough to absorb the sound of gunfire. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The KGB dissolved, but the building did not change hands. The FSB, the modern Russian Federal Security Service, still works there today. It has never acknowledged the executions, never released the names, never opened the archives. Officially, nothing ever happened in the Lubyanka. Directly across the square, in 1990, a group of human rights activists placed a large granite stone. They had brought it from the Solovetsky Islands in the far north of Russia, where the very first Soviet prison camp had been built in 1923. The mother of the Gulag. The only text on the stone is the dedication to the memory of the millions of victims of the totalitarian regime. The FSB offices look down on it. Every day, officers of the modern Russian security state walk past the stone on their way to work. Nobody has ever moved it. The building that did the killing and the stone that remembers it have been sitting next to each other for 35 years. Number 2. In the middle of London, on the north bank of the Thames, stands a fortress that has been there for almost 1,000 years. Nearly 3 million people visit it every year. Almost none of them notice a small patch of grass, the size of a tennis court, tucked between the chapel and one of the inner walls. The names on the memorial in the middle of the grass are queens. From the time of Henry VIII, the English king who had 6 wives and divorced or executed most of them, the Tower of London became the place where people disappeared when the crown had decided it was done with them. Most executions happened outside the walls, on a public hill where crowds could watch. But 7 took place inside, on the patch of grass, now called Tower Green. Execution inside was a privilege, reserved for people whose public death might cause a riot. 3 of those 7 were queens of England, executed within 50 years of each other, and all 3 are buried in the chapel next to the place where they died. The first was Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII, the wife he had torn England apart to marry. 3 years after her coronation, Henry decided he was done with her. She was arrested on charges of adultery and treason, which almost all modern historians believe were fabricated. When she arrived at the tower, she asked whether she would be put in a dungeon. The reply was, "No, madam. You will go into the same rooms you occupied at your coronation." Henry paid for a French swordsman to cross the channel, so her execution could be carried out with a single clean stroke. He married Jane Seymour 11 days later. 6 years later, Henry's 5th wife, Catherine Howard, was executed on the same patch of grass. She was 19. As her boat had passed under London Bridge on the way to the tower, she would have seen the heads of 2 men rotting on spikes. The 2 men she was accused of having slept with, placed there as a warning. 12 years after that, a 17-year-old named Jane Grey was executed on the same spot. She had been queen for 9 days, a Protestant pawn in a failed plot to keep the Catholic Mary I from the throne. Here is the detail nobody tells you when you visit. The young Princess Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, the future Queen Elizabeth I, was herself imprisoned in the Tower, briefly in 1554, on suspicion of plotting against her half-sister. She was allowed, as a privilege of royal birth, to take short walks in the open air. The walks took her along a wall that overlooked Tower Green. Every single day, for weeks, Elizabeth walked past the exact spot where her mother had been beheaded 18 years earlier, and where, if her half-sister changed her mind, she herself might be beheaded in the same week. She was not beheaded. She became queen and reigned for 45 years. Tourists walk over the chapel floor today, where the three queens lie under the pavement, without realizing what they are walking over. And finally, number 1. In Western Berlin, there is a car park, gray asphalt, white lines, a few trees. If you did not know what had been there before, you would walk past it without a second thought. What had been there before was a prison, built in 1876. After the Second World War, it was assigned a new purpose: to hold the 7 Nuremberg defendants sentenced to prison rather than death. The prison was called Spandau, and it was run by a 4-power commission: Britain, France, the United States, and the Soviet Union. Every month, the flag over Spandau changed. January the British, February the French, March the Soviets, April the Americans. This rotation kept running long after the rest of the 4-power system had collapsed. The prisoners were released one by one. By 1966, 6 were gone. That left one man, Rudolf Hess, once the deputy leader of Nazi Germany, the man who had flown solo to Scotland in 1941 on a bizarre one-man peace mission. He had been sentenced to life. He was 72 when the last of his fellow prisoners walked out, and he would be the only prisoner in Spandau for the next 21 years. 147 cells. One man. 4 countries maintained an entire prison in the middle of Berlin. Wardens, cooks, and doctors, a rotating military guard, to hold one elderly Nazi at a cost of around $800,000 a year. A lift was installed so that Hess could reach the garden when his legs became too frail for the stairs. He was allowed to watch television. He was a fan of the American soap operas, Dallas and Dynasty. He was not allowed to watch the news. He spent his days marching in the prison yard, 215 steps in one direction, 215 steps back, every day, for 21 years. On the 17th of August, 1987, Hess walked into a garden summer house carrying an extension cord. A guard left him alone for a few minutes. When the guard came back, Hess had hanged himself. He was 93. The Western powers moved within hours. If Hess ever died, the prison was to be completely destroyed, because Nazi sympathizers treated his imprisonment as martyrdom. And if Spandau were left standing, it would become a shrine. So Spandau was erased. The building was demolished in weeks. The rubble was crushed into powder and dumped into the North Sea, so that no fragment could ever be retrieved. Not a single brick was kept intact. With one exception, a single set of keys was placed in a glass case in a regimental museum in a small Scottish border town. They are the only physical thing that remains. On the site where Spandau had stood, the British built a shopping center for the families of British soldiers still stationed in West Berlin. The supermarket inside it was a British chain called Tesco. The soldiers nicknamed it Hesco's. Today the soldiers are gone. The car park is still there. The most famous prisons in European history are not famous because of what actually happened inside them. They are famous because of what we decided afterwards that they meant. Colditz became a British television series. Reading Jail became a poem. Makronisos became a silence. The Conciergerie became a museum with a wax figure. The Lubyanka never changed hands. The tower became a tourist attraction. Spandau became a car park. What the state builds to erase people, time eventually erases in turn. What remains is the stories. And the stories, as we have seen, are usually wrong. The prisoners were not countless. The walls were not impenetrable. The queens were not always guilty. The airplane really flew. The poet was a number on a door, and on a long gray rock off the coast of Greece, an entire generation was forced to build fake Parthenons. and the fake Parthenons are still out there, crumbling on an island nobody visits. This channel is called Forgotten Europe for a reason. The things we forget are not always the things that were hidden from us. Sometimes they are the things that were right in front of us, behind the names we thought we already knew. If this video was worth something to you, subscribe. There will be more.